Susan's hand trembled as she stood in the middle of Kingsley's private office. The old check felt heavier than paper should feel. Across the room, Kingsley stared at her, not confused, not curious, angry. His jaw tightened. His eyes stayed fixed on Susan as if he had already decided she was guilty of something. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Kingsley broke the silence. "Are you seriously expecting me to believe this story?" The question landed like a slap. Susan swallowed hard. She had cleaned enough wealthy homes across Texas to recognize that look. It was the look people gave when they saw her work uniform before they saw her character. The look that quietly asked whether she belonged in the room. The look that assumed money lived on one side of the conversation and honesty lived on the other. Susan tightened her grip on the check. Her heart pounded. This cleaning job mattered, rent mattered, food mattered, keeping steady work mattered. One wrong move could cost her everything, but she refused to lower her eyes. "Sir," she said carefully, "I didn't come in here looking for trouble." Kingsley let out a short laugh, the kind that carried no humor. "That's interesting because trouble seems to have found its way directly into my office." Susan felt heat rise into her face, not because she was ashamed, because she was tired of being judged before she finished a sentence, tired of people assuming that financial struggle automatically came with bad intentions. The room felt smaller. The distance between them felt larger. Kingsley pointed toward the check. "Do you honestly expect me to believe that you just happened to find that?" Susan looked down at the faded piece of paper. A few minutes earlier, she hadn't even known it existed. Now it was threatening her job, threatening her reputation, and threatening to expose a truth that neither of them fully understood. If you've ever been judged because of your bank account, your job title, or the clothes you wore, you already know how Susan felt in that moment. Because sometimes people decide who you are before they ever learn your name. And Susan was about to learn that this old check carried a secret far bigger than money. Susan took a slow breath. For a moment, she considered turning around and walking out. Not because she was afraid, because she was angry. Angry that honesty was being treated like a crime. Without another word, she stepped closer to Kingsley's desk and carefully placed the old check in front of him. The room fell quiet. Then Susan looked directly at him. Her voice remained calm. "Sir, if I wanted your money, I wouldn't have walked into your office carrying proof." Kingsley's expression changed, only slightly. But Susan noticed it. The confidence behind his accusation weakened. His eyes dropped to the check. For the first time since she entered the room, he actually looked at it instead of looking at her. A few seconds passed. Then something unexpected happened. Kingsley froze. His fingers stopped moving. The color in his face shifted. His eyes narrowed as he focused on a specific name written on the document. The anger disappeared. The suspicion disappeared. Now there was only silence. A heavy silence. Susan watched him carefully. "What's wrong?" she asked. Kingsley didn't answer. He read the name again and again, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The check wasn't shocking because of the amount. It wasn't shocking because it was old. It was shocking because the name connected the document to a piece of history that should never have been forgotten. For the first time, Kingsley looked less like a millionaire and more like a man who had just discovered something he wished he had known years ago. And Susan had no idea that the paper sitting between them was about to change both of their lives forever. Before we continue, let's take a brief moment to pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for another day and another opportunity to learn through life's experiences. Bless everyone listening today. Give strength to those facing challenges, wisdom to those making difficult decisions, and hope to those waiting for better days. Remind us that integrity, kindness, and truth always matter. May this story encourage and inspire someone who needs it today. Amen. Welcome to Love, Money, and Secret, where America's greatest stories and life lessons meet creativity and heart. If you're new to the family, we're grateful to have you here. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It helps us bring more unforgettable stories your way. And before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. If you believe honesty still matters no matter how much money someone has, leave a like on this video. Every like, comment, and subscription helps YouTube share these stories with more people who enjoy meaningful and inspiring content. Now let's find out why one forgotten check turned a routine cleaning job into the biggest moment of Susan's life. Long before Susan stood inside Kingsley's private office with that old check in her hand, she was waking up before sunrise in a small Texas apartment, staring at a ceiling fan that made more noise than wind. She opened one eye and sighed. Lord, if this fan quits today, I'm charging it rent. Her phone buzzed beside her pillow. Another bill reminder. Susan picked it up, looked at the amount, and made a face. Well, good morning to you too, financial attack. She sat up slowly, stretched her tired shoulders, and reached for the notebook she kept near her bed. Inside were numbers, crossed-out plans, small payments, and hopeful calculations that rarely obeyed her wishes. Rent, electricity, groceries, bus fare, work supplies. She tapped the pen against her chin. Susan, you may be broke, she whispered to herself, but at least you still have manners and moisturizer. That was how Susan survived hard days, she joked before worry could swallow the room. She was 30 years old, hardworking, and proud without being arrogant. She cleaned homes across Texas, sometimes 2 in one day, sometimes with sore feet and an empty stomach, but she never carried herself like life had defeated her. In her neighborhood, people knew her as the woman who could make anybody laugh while still telling the truth straight. After Sunday service, she helped stack chairs, packed leftovers, and checked on people who had less than she did. One older woman once told her, "Baby, you need help too." Susan smiled and said, "I know, but helping somebody else reminds me I'm still useful." She came from a community where money did not always stretch far, but love did. Somebody always had a pot of beans on the stove. Somebody always had a prayer ready, and somebody always knew how to make hard times feel less lonely. Still, Susan refused pity. If someone tried to speak to her like poverty was a disease, she corrected them with grace. "I'm not helpless," she would say. "I'm just temporarily underfunded." That morning, she washed her face, tied back her hair, packed her cleaning gloves, and checked her work schedule. 3 houses were listed, but one address stood out. A mansion outside Dallas. The note beside it said, "Private office, deep cleaning required." Susan raised an eyebrow. "Private office?" she muttered. "That sounds like rich people dust with secrets." She had no idea how right she was. She grabbed her bag, locked her apartment door, and walked toward the bus stop with her head high. To Susan, it was just another cleaning job, but by the end of that assignment, her life would no longer be the same. While Susan was calculating bus fare and bill payments, Kingsley was waking up in a mansion large enough that some rooms sat unused for months. From the outside, his life looked perfect. The kind of life people pointed at and said, "He has everything." Kingsley often wished that were true. At 45, he owned more than he could personally enjoy. Luxury vehicles filled his garage, his investments continued growing, business associates called him successful, invitations arrived constantly. Yet most evenings ended the same way. A large dining table, a quiet house, and one person eating alone. Kingsley stood by a kitchen counter that morning, holding a cup of coffee. The house was silent. No laughter. No conversation, just the sound of a refrigerator humming somewhere in the distance. He looked around the expensive room. Years ago, he had believed money would eventually create happiness. Instead, it had mostly created convenience. There was a difference. His phone buzzed, another invitation, another business dinner, another event where people would smile, shake hands, discuss money, and pretend everyone was enjoying themselves. Kingsley sighed. Nothing says excitement like 3 hours of people pretending they're not checking each other's bank accounts. He tossed the phone onto the counter. The joke made him smile for about 2 seconds. Then the silence returned. That silence had become familiar, too familiar. Most people who approached Kingsley wanted something: connections, contracts, opportunities, access. Very few seemed interested in knowing who he actually was. Sometimes he wondered whether people would even recognize him without the money attached to his name. That thought stayed with him longer than he liked. By late afternoon, Kingsley drove to another business dinner. The restaurant was beautiful, the food was expensive, the conversations felt empty. People laughed at jokes that were not funny. People complimented one another while quietly competing against each other. By the time the evening ended, Kingsley felt more exhausted than when it started. Returning home, he noticed dust gathering in areas of the mansion he rarely entered. Several rooms needed attention, especially the old private office he had not properly used in years. The next morning, he contacted a professional cleaning company and scheduled a full deep cleaning service. He barely thought about it afterward. To him, it was another routine task. A phone call, a scheduled appointment, nothing more. Hours later, the cleaning company assigned the job. When Susan reviewed her upcoming work list, she froze. The address was impossible to miss. One of the largest properties she had ever been assigned. Susan stared at the mansion listing, then laughed softly. "Well, Susan," she said, shaking her head, "looks like you're cleaning billionaire-level dust today." She packed her supplies and prepared for the assignment. Neither Susan nor Kingsley realized that a forgotten piece of paper hidden inside that mansion was already waiting for them. And the truth attached to it was about to connect two lives that had never crossed before. The following morning, Susan stepped off the bus carrying her cleaning supplies and nearly stopped walking. The mansion was even bigger in person. She looked up, then up a little more, then laughed. "All right, Susan," she said quietly. "If somebody gets lost inside this place, they might need GPS and snacks." The front of the property stretched across a massive section of land outside Dallas. Perfect grass, tall windows, stone walkways. Everything looked expensive. Even the mailbox looked like it paid taxes. Susan adjusted her cleaning bag and headed toward the entrance. She had worked inside wealthy homes before, but this one felt different. Not warmer, not colder, just quieter, almost like nobody was truly living inside all that space. After checking in, Susan got to work. The first few hours were routine. Dusting, vacuuming, polishing surfaces, organizing shelves, nothing unusual, nothing exciting, just another day earning an honest paycheck. Around midday, she reached the section listed in the assignment notes. Private office. Susan opened the door and immediately raised an eyebrow. "Well," she said softly, "this room definitely belongs to somebody who enjoys paperwork more than happiness." The office looked untouched. Shelves lined the walls, boxes sat in corners, old files filled cabinets, a layer of dust covered several surfaces. Unlike the rest of the mansion, this room felt forgotten. Susan rolled up her sleeves. If dust paid rent, this room would be fully occupied. She started cleaning methodically, desk first, shelves second, cabinets third. Several hours passed. Eventually, she reached an older wooden desk positioned near the back wall. One drawer refused to open. Susan pulled again. Nothing. She tried a different angle. Still nothing. "Don't do this today," she muttered. A final tug caused the drawer to slide open suddenly. Several old papers shifted inside. A small stack slipped sideways. Something fell behind the drawer compartment. Susan crouched down, carefully reached inside, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. At first it looked insignificant, just another old document. The paper was aged, slightly yellow, folded several times. Susan unfolded it slowly, then froze. It was a check, not a receipt, not a note, a check. Her eyes moved toward the amount. The number instantly caught her attention. Susan blinked once, then looked again. The amount was large enough to change her entire financial situation. For several seconds she simply stared. Then her attention moved lower, toward the name. The moment she read it, the room seemed to go completely silent. Her heart skipped. Because she knew that name, she knew it very well, and there was absolutely no reason it should have been sitting inside. Kingsley's private office. Susan remained crouched beside the desk for several moments. The check rested in her hands. She read the name again, then again, each time hoping she had made a mistake. She hadn't. The name was real. The amount was real. And somehow both were sitting inside Kingsley's old office. Slowly, Susan stood up and moved to a nearby chair. Her cleaning supplies sat forgotten on the other side of the room. For the first time that day, work no longer mattered. Questions did. A lot of questions. She carefully examined the document. The check was old, very old. The date alone told her that. The edges had faded from time, yet the writing remained clear enough to read. Susan stared at the family name once more. A memory surfaced. Not a complete memory, just pieces. Conversations she had heard growing up, stories mentioned during family gatherings, comments spoken by older relatives when they thought children were. Not paying attention, promises, work, sacrifice, money that never arrived. At the time, Susan had never paid much attention. Children rarely do. Now those forgotten conversations suddenly felt important, very important. She leaned back in the chair. "What are you doing here?" she whispered to the check. The office offered no answer, only silence. Susan looked around the room. The mansion, the expensive furniture, the polished walls, the wealth. Then she looked back at the check. Part of her wanted to place it exactly where she found it. Close the drawer, finish cleaning, go home. Forget she had ever seen it. Life would stay simple, safe, predictable. She would keep her job, collect her paycheck, move on. But another part of her couldn't ignore what sat in her hands. If this document meant what she suspected it meant, then it represented more than money. It represented truth, and truth deserved daylight. Susan stood and paced slowly across the office. Her thoughts moved in circles. If she spoke up, Kingsley might think she was trying to take advantage of him. If she stayed silent, she might spend the rest of her life wondering what would have happened if she had said something. Neither choice felt comfortable. She stopped walking, looked down at the check, then laughed softly. Not because anything was funny, because she already knew herself too well. "Susan," she said, shaking her head, "you are terrible at minding your business when something isn't right." That was the problem. Her conscience never stayed quiet for long. She thought about the values she had carried her entire life. Work honestly, treat people fairly, tell the truth, do the right thing even when nobody is watching. Those principles had never made her rich, but they had helped her sleep at night. Finally, her decision became clear. She folded the check carefully, placed it inside a document sleeve, picked up her cleaning cloth, finished the remaining section of the office, and once everything was in order, she took a long breath. The hallway outside stretched toward the main part of the mansion. Somewhere in the house Kingsley was working. Susan looked toward that direction. Her stomach tightened. Not from fear, from uncertainty. She had no idea how the conversation would go. She only knew it needed to happen. Holding the check securely, Susan stepped out of the office and started walking toward Kingsley. The truth was no longer something she could leave inside a drawer. Susan found Kingsley in a large home office near the center of the mansion. He was seated behind a desk reviewing documents when she knocked, lightly on the open door. Kingsley looked up. "Everything all right?" Susan stepped inside. "Actually, sir, I found something while cleaning." Kingsley leaned back slightly. "What kind of something?" Susan approached carefully and placed the document sleeve on the desk. The moment Kingsley saw the old check, confusion crossed his face. He picked it up, looked at it briefly, then looked back at Susan. "Where did you get this?" "In the old office." "The old office?" Susan nodded. "It was hidden behind a drawer compartment." Kingsley studied her face, then looked back at the document. Something about his expression changed. Not concern, not curiosity, suspicion. His voice became noticeably colder. "And you expect me to believe that?" Susan blinked. "I'm sorry? You just happen to find an old check connected to private records?" The accusation was subtle, but Susan heard it. Kingsley stood and walked around the desk. His eyes never left the document. "I've dealt with people trying to manipulate situations before." Susan folded her arms. "Are you suggesting I created a 20-year-old check during my lunch break?" Kingsley didn't smile. Susan did, a little, because if she didn't laugh, she might get angry. The room became quiet. Kingsley looked at the check again. "Then explain why you're bringing this directly to me." Susan stared at him. "Because that's what honest people do." The answer arrived instantly, without hesitation, without performance, without fear. For a moment, Kingsley seemed caught off guard. Susan continued, "If I wanted to hide it, you would never have seen it." Kingsley said nothing. Susan took a breath. "I found the check." She pointed toward the document. "I recognize the family name." Kingsley's eyebrows narrowed. "You know that name?" "Yes." His attention sharpened immediately. Susan carefully chose her words. She wasn't interested in making dramatic claims. She wanted facts. Nothing more. "Growing up, I heard conversations connected to that name." Kingsley remained silent. "Work that was completed." She paused. "A promise that wasn't fulfilled." Kingsley stared at her. "You expect me to believe a story based on family conversations?" Susan nodded slowly. "No." That answer surprised him. "No?" "No, sir." She pointed toward the check. "I expect you to believe evidence." Kingsley looked down again. The response landed harder than he expected. Susan continued calmly. "I didn't come here asking for money." "True." "I didn't ask for compensation." "Also true." "I brought you a document." "True again." The facts left little room for argument. Yet Kingsley remained uncertain. Years of wealth had taught him to question motives. Years of experience had taught him that not everyone approached him honestly. But something about Susan didn't fit the pattern. She wasn't demanding, she wasn't bargaining, she wasn't threatening, she was simply standing there waiting for the truth. Kingsley finally sat back down. His eyes returned to the check, then to Susan, then back to the check again. Several seconds passed. Finally, he spoke. "If this document means what you think it means." He stopped. Susan waited. Kingsley looked at the family name one more time, then nodded slowly. "I'm going to investigate this myself." For the first time since entering the room, Susan felt a small sense of relief, because whatever happened next, the truth had finally begun moving. After Susan left the office, Kingsley remained seated at his desk. The mansion felt unusually quiet. The old check lay in front of him. For several minutes, he simply stared at it. Part of him wanted to dismiss the entire situation. Life had taught him to be cautious. Money attracted stories. Money attracted opportunists. Money attracted people looking for shortcuts. Yet Susan had not behaved like any of those people. That bothered him, because the easier explanation was that she was wrong. The harder explanation was that she was right. Kingsley picked up the check again. His eyes moved carefully across every line. The date, the amount, the signature, the family name, everything looked authentic. Nothing looked altered. Nothing looked recently created. The document appeared exactly what it claimed to be. Old, forgotten, real. Kingsley leaned back in his chair. Then he stood abruptly. If answers existed, they would be inside the mansion. The property contained decades of archived business records, storage, boxes, financial files, and documents that nobody had reviewed in years. He headed toward the old office Susan had cleaned earlier. For the first time, he looked at the room differently, not as unused space, but as a place holding unfinished history. Kingsley began opening cabinets, reviewing folders, sorting paperwork. Dust gathered on his sleeves. Hours passed. Several times he almost stopped. Several times he convinced himself he was wasting time. Then he found the first clue. A financial ledger, old enough to match the period shown on the check. Kingsley's attention sharpened immediately. He turned pages carefully. Numbers, transactions, project notes, payment schedules. Most entries meant nothing. Then he saw it. The same family name. His stomach tightened. Kingsley lowered himself into a chair and continued reading. A second reference appeared, then a third. The name was not random. The name existed throughout multiple records. That changed everything. Because Susan had never seen these documents, there was no way she could have known they existed. Kingsley continued searching. The deeper he looked, the more uncomfortable he became. The records pointed toward work that had been completed, services provided, obligations discussed, payments expected. Yet the documentation suddenly stopped, almost as if a chapter had been left unfinished. Kingsley rubbed his forehead. This doesn't make sense. But it did make sense, just not in the way he wanted. For the first time, Susan's words began carrying weight. She had never demanded anything. She had never exaggerated. She had simply presented the check and allowed the evidence to speak. Kingsley remembered the suspicion in his own voice, the assumptions, the doubts, the way he had immediately questioned her motives. Now those assumptions felt less convincing. He returned to the ledger, carefully comparing dates, checking references, reviewing attached notes. Each new document moved him farther from certainty and closer to an uncomfortable possibility. Susan had not invented a story. Susan had discovered one, a story that had been sitting unnoticed inside his own property. By evening, Kingsley had assembled a small collection of records across the desk. The pieces were incomplete, but they matched, and every match weakened his confidence in the conclusions he had reached earlier. He stared out the window for a long moment. The evidence was no longer supporting his suspicions. The evidence was supporting Susan, and for a man who prided himself on being right, that realization was difficult to ignore. Before we continue, we want to hear from you. Have you ever been judged before someone took the time to learn the truth? Share your experience in the comments below. And if you've ever had to prove your character when people assumed the worst, let us know where you're watching from and how you handled it. Your story might encourage someone else today. The next morning, Kingsley returned to the records before sunrise. The collection of documents covered nearly every surface in the old office: financial ledgers, archived agreements, payment records, boxes that had remained unopened for years. The previous evening had raised questions. Today he wanted answers. Coffee sat untouched beside him as he worked through another stack of files. Hours passed. Page after page revealed more pieces of the same story, not one dramatic discovery. Many small discoveries, each one adding another piece to the picture. The family name appeared again, and again, and again. Kingsley carefully organized every reference. By midday, a clear pattern had emerged. The check had never been random. It had been connected to legitimate work, real work, documented work. The records showed agreements tied to a major project from years earlier. Services had been completed. Responsibilities had been fulfilled. Commitments had been acknowledged. The paperwork proved it. Kingsley continued reading. His expression grew more serious with every page. Because one thing became impossible to ignore. A payment had been prepared. A payment had been approved. A payment had even been documented. Yet the final completion record never appeared. The process simply stopped. Kingsley searched through additional files. Eventually, he found another document attached to the same timeline. Then another. Together, they explained what had happened. The money represented compensation that should have been delivered long ago. Not charity, not generosity, not a favor. Earned compensation. The difference mattered. A lot. Kingsley leaned back in his chair. Susan's family had not been asking for special treatment. They had been waiting for something they had already earned. The realization sat heavily with him, because the records left little room for debate. The obligation existed, the payment existed, the promise existed, the fulfillment never happened. Kingsley stared at the old check resting beside the files. For years it had remained hidden inside a forgotten drawer. For years nobody had questioned its existence. For years an unfinished obligation had quietly remained unresolved. Until Susan found it. A woman who had entered the mansion to clean floors and dust furniture had accidentally uncovered a truth that generations of paperwork had buried. Kingsley shook his head slowly. What are the chances? But deep down he knew this was bigger than chance. If Susan had ignored the check, nobody would have known. If she had hidden it, nobody would have known. If she had walked away, nobody would have known. Instead, she chose honesty. And honesty had exposed a wrong that should have been corrected years earlier. Kingsley looked across the office. Every major question had now been answered. Everything Susan suggested was supported by evidence. Everything she remembered from family conversations matched the records. The truth was finally clear. And now Kingsley had to decide what kind of man he wanted to be after discovering it. Kingsley found Susan in the old office later that afternoon. She had returned to finish organizing the final shelves, but the moment she saw his face, she knew something had changed. He was no longer looking at her with suspicion. He was looking at her like man carrying shame. Susan lowered the cloth in her hand. "You found something," she said. Kingsley nodded slowly. "Yes." Susan waited. Kingsley stepped into the room holding several documents. "I found enough to know you were telling the truth." Susan did not smile. She did not clap. She did not say, "I told you so." She simply stood there quietly, as if the confirmation hurt more than it pleased her. Kingsley noticed. "I owe you an apology," he said. Susan looked at him carefully. "For the check? For the way I treated you before I understood it." That answer reached her. Kingsley placed the papers on the desk. "I assumed you wanted something from me." Susan gave a small, tired laugh. "Sir, everybody wants something. The question is whether they're honest about it." Kingsley lowered his eyes. "You were honest." "Yes," Susan said softly. "But you didn't believe that until paper defended me." The words landed hard. Kingsley had no quick reply. Susan folded her arms, not harshly, but protectively. "I didn't bring that check because I wanted to embarrass anyone. I brought it because if my family worked for something, somebody should have honored it." Kingsley nodded. "You're right. And I don't want charity. I understand." "No," Susan said gently. "I need you to really understand. Poor people get offered pity too often when what they actually deserve is fairness." Kingsley looked at her, and for the first time he saw more than strength. He saw restraint, pain handled with grace, anger disciplined by character, humor that had been carrying weight for years. You deserved respect from the beginning, he said. Susan's expression softened, but only a little. That would have been nice. The corner of Kingsley's mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile, more like regret trying to become humility. I want to make this right. Susan looked down at the documents. Then make it right because it's right, not because you feel guilty. Kingsley nodded. That's fair. A quiet moment passed between them, different from the earlier silence. This one did not feel cold. It felt honest. Kingsley studied her face and realized something unexpected. Susan had walked into his mansion as a cleaner, but she had carried more integrity than many people who sat at his expensive dinner tables. And Susan, though still careful, saw something changing in him too. Not perfection, not romance yet, but willingness. That mattered. Kingsley picked up the old check and handed it back to her. This started with your courage, he said. Susan accepted it. No, she replied. It started with somebody failing to do right. I just refused to help the mistake stay hidden. For the first time, Kingsley smiled with real warmth. Susan noticed. Her own smile came slowly, small, guarded, but real. And in that quiet Texas mansion, trust took its first careful step forward. Within the next few days, Kingsley did exactly what he promised. He did not hide behind private apologies. He did not send Susan away with quiet money and expect her to disappear. He gathered the records, reviewed the unpaid amount, added the value that should have grown over the years, and made sure the correction was documented properly. Susan sat across from him at the desk, watching every step. Kingsley looked up from the paperwork. I want you to review this before anything is finalized. Susan raised an eyebrow. You sure you want me reading rich people papers? I might start charging consultation fees. Kingsley smiled. You should... Susan laughed softly, but she took the papers seriously. She read slowly, asked questions, and refused to let anyone treat her like she was just there to receive a favor. This says compensation, she said. Kingsley nodded. Because that's what it is. Not donation, not charity. No. Susan looked at him for a long moment. Good. Because my family didn't work in hope of somebody feeling generous. Kingsley's voice softened. I know. That was when Susan finally signed. The money came through as a rightful correction, not a handout. It was enough to clear pressure from her life, settle old burdens, and give her space to breathe without fear sitting beside every bill. But Susan did not become loud with it. She did not parade it. She did not let money change her walk, her speech, or her heart. When people in her community learned the truth, they celebrated her with food, laughter, prayer, and the kind of joy that made even hard years feel lighter. Susan stood among them, shaking her head as someone handed her another plate. If y'all keep feeding me like this, justice is about to require stretchy pants. Laughter filled the room. Kingsley stood nearby, quiet at first, watching something he rarely saw in his wealthy circles. Real happiness. No one was pretending. No one was measuring status. No one was trying to impress him. They were simply happy that truth had finally been honored. Susan noticed him standing apart and walked over. You look confused. I'm not confused, Kingsley said. I'm learning... Learning what? He looked around at the smiling faces, then back at her. That money can fill a bank account and still leave a room empty. Susan's teasing smile faded into something gentler. And what fills a room? Kingsley answered without looking away. People who care without calculating. Susan held his gaze. For a second, neither of them spoke. Something warm passed between them, quiet but clear. Kingsley admired her now for more than honesty. He admired how she carried justice without pride, how she accepted restoration without losing humility, how she could stand in truth and still leave room for grace. Susan looked down first, smiling. Careful, Mr. Millionaire. You keep talking like that, people might think you have a heart. Kingsley smiled back. I'm starting to think you found that too. Susan laughed, but this time her cheeks warmed. Justice had been served. But something softer was beginning too. The months that followed felt different for both Susan and Kingsley, not because everything suddenly became perfect, because life finally felt honest. Susan continued working, though not because she had to anymore. She believed work gave people purpose. The financial pressure that once followed her everywhere had finally eased, but she remained the same woman who joked with strangers, helped stack chairs after church, and checked on neighbors before checking on herself. One Saturday afternoon, Kingsley found himself sitting in the middle of a community gathering with a paper plate balanced awkwardly on his knee. Susan noticed. "You look nervous." Kingsley looked down at the overflowing plate. "I think somebody here believes every problem can be solved with extra food." Susan laughed. "That's because around here, food is how people say they care." Kingsley looked around, children playing, people talking, laughter floating through the air. Nobody cared about his money. Nobody asked about investments. Nobody wanted a business opportunity. For once, people treated him like a person, not a bank account. And he realized something surprising. He looked forward to these gatherings more than any event he had attended in years. Susan sat beside him. "You've gotten quieter." Kingsley smiled. "I was thinking. Dangerous hobby." "Probably." She laughed. The sound made him smile wider. That had become one of his favorite things. Not the joke itself. The fact that Susan always managed to bring warmth into places that needed it. For a while they sat comfortably without speaking. The silence no longer felt awkward. It felt peaceful. Finally, Kingsley turned toward her. "You changed my life." Susan immediately shook her head. "No, I didn't." "You did. I found a check." "You found the truth." Susan looked away for a moment. Kingsley continued. "And you reminded me that character matters more than status." Susan's expression softened. "Well, you reminded me that not every wealthy person measures people by money." Kingsley smiled. "I'll take that compliment." A quiet moment passed. Then Kingsley reached for her hand. Not suddenly, not dramatically, carefully, giving her every chance to pull away. Susan looked down, then back up at him, and she let her hand remain in his. The smile that followed was small, but it carried trust, the kind of trust that takes time to earn, the kind that cannot be purchased, the kind built through honesty, respect, and patience. Kingsley squeezed her hand gently. "I'd like to keep seeing where this goes." Susan raised an eyebrow. "That's your millionaire version of flirting?" I was nervous. "You should be," Kingsley laughed. Susan joined him, and for the first time in a very long time, both of them felt hopeful. About the future. Not because of money, not because of old documents, not because of the check, because two people had chosen truth. And truth had led them somewhere neither expected. Susan entered Kingsley's mansion as a cleaner. She left it as the woman who reminded a millionaire that integrity is worth more than wealth. Kingsley began the story believing success meant having more. He ended it understanding that success means valuing what truly matters. Because money can reveal character, but it cannot replace character. Being poor does not make someone dishonest. Being rich does not guarantee happiness. And real love grows strongest when respect comes first. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to leave a like on this video. Tell us in the comments what lessons stayed with you the most. Share this story with someone who believes honesty still matters. And if you're new to love, money, and secret, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another unforgettable story. Thank you for spending this time with us. Until next time, remember, the truth may stay hidden for years, but when it finally comes forward, it has the power to heal far more than a bank account.